The other, older Kong arrives on the VCS as Atari Archive hits on the debut of Tigervision and visits the Room of Doom. It is probably not a big coincidence that in this same basic time period that Coleco released Donkey Kong for the VCS, we saw another company trying to capitalize on Kong mania. This time, however, they eschewed Nintendo's arcade game in favor of the original movie monster, King Kong, starring what is effectively a clone of Nintendo's game. As an aside, this episode appears to be a catch-up for at least two of these titles, but it's not necessarily my fault. Documents recently made available to me, namely the court documents for Universal vs. Nintendo and scans of Logical Gamer, push King Kong and Room of Doom to July, and while I can't prove it, it's likely Threshold debuted that month as well. Video Game Update pinged King Kong and Threshold is releasing August 1st for what it's worth, putting them very early in the month, at worst. King Kong and our second game in this video, Threshold, come to us from newcomer Tigervision, the video game label for Tiger Toys. You may be most familiar with Tiger through the company's electronic toys and handheld games, which were its bread and butter from its founding in 1978 through the 1990s. But Tiger was also one of many companies that smelled money on the wind in game cartridges in the wake of Space Invaders and Activision's success, and sought to carve out a piece of that pie for itself. Tiger's electronic toys effectively ran the gamut of anything that could fit into a microprocessor. And like other toy companies, Tiger sourced its products from outside design firms, such as Marvin Glass and Associates. And one of those companies factors into the development and release of King Kong for the VCS, written by Karl Olinger. I was able to get in touch with Olinger, and he shed some welcome light into this game and Tiger's involvement with the VCS generally. Olinger didn't work for Tiger or even Marvin Glass, but rather an Illinois-based company called Software Electronics, which was started by former Motorola manager Ron Taylor. Olinger had been recruited by Taylor from Motorola as well when he left, and was set to the task of making electronic games for Tiger and Marvin Glass. During his 3-year tenure, Olinger remembered Tiger requesting VCS games of them. While he had no insight into why, one can surmise the market forces that saw electronic toys fall out of the zeitgeist in favor of video games played a role, just as they had for fellow toy company Parker Brothers. As Olinger remembered it, Taylor brought in Bill Hogue from Big 5 Software as he and his partner had reverse-engineered the VCS's video chip. He himself also wrote some documentation about how the video chip for the VCS interacted with the 6507 microprocessor. This technical know-how led Software Electronics to develop several games for the VCS, and here in July 1982, Olinger debuted their first internal title with King Kong. As to how Tiger Electronics wound up with the King Kong license, we have a great deal of detail in the court documents from Universal MCA vs. Nintendo, the court case where Universal sued Nintendo claiming that Donkey Kong aped their rights to King Kong, a battle Nintendo won after it noted that Universal had successfully argued a few short years prior that King Kong was in the public domain. Special thanks to Norm the Gaming Historian for getting these papers some years ago from the National Archives, and to historian Ethan Johnson for sharing his copies of them with me. According to the case's depositions and judge's opinion, Tiger president Randy Rissman first saw Donkey Kong at a Tokyo arcade around the summer of 1981, and upon his return, he sought out the license to King Kong, determining that Universal held it. Given that there was little interest in licensing King Kong at the time, around September, Tiger got an exclusive license to produce a tabletop, electronic game, and a VCS cart, starting work on the former internally and contracting out the latter around the same time. At some point, Tiger even brought in a Donkey Kong arcade machine for its designers to study. In early 1982, Universal MCA became aware of Donkey Kong, and following the February Toy Fair, held internal discussions on whether to continue licensing out King Kong. Coupled with Tiger already breaching the contract by failing to keep Universal's parent company, MCA, in the loop on the development of their games, and the likelihood that it would be a Donkey Kong clone. As such, the staff there agreed to try and reach Tiger to terminate the contract. At the same time, Universal MCA started communicating to Nintendo and Coleco about its concerns over Donkey Kong, which would have been complicated by an exclusive Tiger agreement that would have been nowhere near as lucrative. Coleco negotiated a royalty arrangement. Nintendo simply accepted the lawsuit. With this all in mind, Universal tried to end the agreement with Tiger around May 4th, 1982, unless they received materials showing their game wasn't just a ripoff. Rissman sent over their in-development materials regarding the portable version, and Tiger's response that it had subsequently determined that Universal didn't have actual rights to King Kong to necessarily terminate. In correspondence, Universal requested a few changes to the tabletop game. The barrels King Kong throws were to be changed to bombs, the hero got a firefighter's helmet, and the floors you're climbing up were changed from zigzags a la the DK arcade layout. In June, the license was amended to be non-exclusive, and both versions of King Kong moved ahead with their releases, with the VCS version going out in July and the tabletop in small quantities the following month. As the ostensibly original work of the two initial Tigervision releases, it's unfortunate that King Kong is a bit shy of really matching up to the other platforming games coming out at about the same time. Olinger describes it as a knockoff of Donkey Kong, and indeed it seems to take its cues from that game's barrel stage in particular. It does start off with a cute sequence of Kong jumping up the Empire State Building and depositing an unnamed girl, presumably Fay Ray, at the pinnacle. You, as the unnamed hero, need to work your way up by jumping over gaps, climbing ladders, and avoiding bombs King Kong is throwing at you. If a bomb touches you, it explodes and you start over at the bottom. In an odd twist, once you get over halfway up, King Kong will jump and screen wrap to the bottom, and the bombs will all change directions and begin rolling back up the screen. Once you reach the top and rescue Fay Ray, the game starts over with faster bombs. All the while, a little tune plays in the background that sounds like the store-brand version of the Donkey Kong barrel stage music, just in case it wasn't clear enough what the inspiration for this title was. The big twist on this compared to Donkey Kong are the magic bombs, which are shaped differently and when jumped over, launch your character up to the next floor. This is actually rather welcome much of the time, as your slow walking speed and the ladders being a bit fussy about when you can actually start climbing them, they can put you in an awkward spot at times. The game variations on the cart let you choose between whether bombs are fast or slow, the presence of magic bombs, and if the game is being played by one or two people. The difficulty switches have no function on this cart. In all, King Kong is fine, but has an awkward difficulty curve due to your walk speed and the bomb speed. Even on the slow bomb game modes, you will easily find yourself in a bad spot and lose a life if you don't play carefully. And it takes so long to get back to where you died that it loses some of its luster. Additionally, you are unable to jump bombs on the highest floor of the building, which means you very much have to plan your approach carefully, or otherwise wait for a magic bomb to jump over near the center ladder on the floor below. What may hurt this game more than anything is the near-simultaneous release of Coleco's Donkey Kong VCS port in late July and early August. For all its faults, Gary Kitchen's take on the arcade game had the benefit of being officially licensed, so it didn't need to take liberties with the actual play, and it also just feels snappier to play in general. VCS Donkey Kong doesn't have all the game modes that King Kong has, however, which does give this package a bit more to flesh it out despite the single screen. I've mentioned the portable version of King Kong in passing, but since this appears to have been the catalyst for the VCS game's existence, it's worth delving into with a little more detail. The company published a standalone electronic game version that is largely similar, but adds in a fire axe item to help clear bombs and a little victory kiss upon clearing the stage. It's as simple as you'd expect a portable game to be from the early 80s, but it appears to have been pretty well received. Based on court documentation, we do have information on how well King Kong sold in both its VCS and portable incarnations. From July through December, Tiger sold 57,592 copies of the VCS cartridge, but also saw 2,377 returned in the latter 3 months of the year. The portable unit, meanwhile, started making its way into stores primarily in September, beyond a handful sold in August, moving 9,268 units with 39 returns. We have no details for 1983, but this is a great glimpse into what kind of sales these third parties were looking at when they lacked the market muscle and storefront connections that Atari, Mattel, and earlier third parties like Activision and Magic were able to cultivate, as well as a look at the early stages of the crash, with those late cartridge returns primarily in December. As for Olinger, with King Kong completed, he said his role for VCS game development largely shifted over to providing support for other game developers at Software Electronics. He remembered the job being fairly grueling to try and get products finished in time for the Winter Consumer Electronics Show the entire 3-year stint he worked there, and after being tapped to work on a VCS port of the obscure arcade game Springer, he wound up leaving and starting his own business, doing embedded design, hardware, software, and PCB design, building automation, healthcare communications, and alarm systems for RVs and boats. He finally retired in 2019, before being pulled out of retirement to work with a client on HVAC and building automation. While he may have had only a brief stint in the video game industry, it's clear the design chops were there, just not perhaps the time to really make King Kong shine. Tiger's other debut VCS title, Threshold, is actually a licensed computer game from Online Systems, perhaps better known by its later name, Sierra Online. As a computer game company, Online Systems early on was effectively only publishing for the Apple II and Atari 8-bits, but co-founder Ken Williams was interested in expanding to other platforms. In what was seemingly the first step towards that, the company came to an arrangement with Tiger to publish 3 of its computer games on the VCS: Threshold, Jawbreaker, and Marauder. Threshold was the first out the door, coming a few months before its brethren. Threshold itself is a space shooter, a genre that is quickly dominating console games generally, and while the VCS port is a little stripped down compared to the Apple II original, the title comes through in largely decent shape. Threshold was originally designed by Warren Schwader, who did an extensive interview with James Hague around 2002. Schwader had been the first outside programmer hired by Online Systems, having previously been a machinist apprentice at the Parker Pen Company, who wrote computer programs out on paper during his downtime at work. After Parker Pen closed and he failed to find another machinist job, he started work on real computer games for the Apple II, which became High-Res Cribbage and Thrilogy, which found their way to Ken and Roberta Williams' game company. Schwader was hired in, and after seeing a copy of the arcade game Astro Blaster at the Awani Tack and Feed store, Ken Williams set him to the task of making a game with the same basic concept. Astro Blaster deserves something of a sidebar, as it not only serves as the inspiration to Threshold, but also to Activision's massive hit Mega Mania, which debuted in September 1982. According to historian Keith Smith, Astro Blaster was developed at Sega Gremlin by Barbara Michaelick and Gary Shannon. Shannon had cut his teeth as a computer programmer in the 1960s and was an early adopter of the Apple II upon its release, producing games for it that were published through Programma International before joining Gremlin around late 1979. Shannon told Smith that David Rosen, the head of Sega Gremlin, showed them an outer space shooter from another company and asked them to design something similar but better. Shannon designed the initial demo, at which point Michaelick was assigned to help make the full game. What they came up with was a vertical shooter where enemy ships appear in waves and must be destroyed to continue. Players do need to be mindful of their fuel gauge, which is constantly ticking down, and of their laser's heat gauge. If the laser overheats, they must wait for it to cool off to fire it again. Finally, you have the warp button that slows down enemies on screen, akin to what Communist Mutants would do on the VCS. What really sets it apart from the other contemporary vertical shooters are the diverse array of enemies and attack patterns each wave has, as well as a refueling sequence in between sectors and secret bonuses that you can earn by doing specific actions on each wave, a kind of precursor to the secret bonuses found in games like Bump and Jump or Xevious. Astro Blaster appears to have debuted around February 1981 and was generally regarded as a modest hit for Sega Gremlin. With this in mind, Threshold in its original incarnation carries over a lot of Astro Blaster's functionality and game mechanics. Dropping the secret bonuses and the warp button, Threshold carries over the heat and fuel gauges, a refueling sequence, which is now done automatically, and most importantly, a breadth of different alien opponents, with changing graphics and attack patterns with every wave. Schwader said that even after hours of playing Astro Blaster, he and Ken Williams kept encountering new enemies, and that they wanted to bring that particular experience home. Ultimately, the game had 24 levels of unique creatures, though Schwader remarked that he got letters at the time from people complaining that it was too difficult for them to make it to the end. In all, this original version of the game took about 4 months to write, with Ken helping out in the initial 2 weeks to write the animation engine. It appears to have reviewed well, and Schrader estimated the game sold around 25,000 copies, far more than his earlier works and enough for him to feel it was successful. And since Ken Williams wanted conversions to the Atari 800 and the VCS, Schrader was on the hook to produce those as well. Online Systems went on to produce cartridges for the Atari computers, the Commodore 64, and the ColecoVision, including rather faithful ports of Threshold to basically all of these. But for the VCS, the company partnered with Tiger. Threshold on the VCS is stripped down from the Apple II and Atari 8-bit computer versions, losing out on the refueling sequences and the heat gauge. Even the fuel gauge has been reconsidered here as simply a bonus score gauge to encourage you to fight your way through the enemy waves faster. There are also fewer varieties of enemies and attack patterns to contend with. But the actual core shooting gameplay is largely intact here, and the game features some very well animated foes. Each group of enemies have their own movements to be mindful of, and they aren't shy about firing back at you. As you progress, your foes are worth more points. Earning 20,000 and 40,000 points earns you some extra lives, up to a maximum of 3. While you can't rapid fire the same way you could on the Apple II, the VCS Threshold lets you reset your shots each time you press a button, giving you the opportunity to take another shot immediately if your first one whiffed everything. And in a bit of a twist, while most of the shooters we've seen recently use game options to choose whether or not your bullets are guided, which is to say they follow you as you move left or right, the difficulty switches here choose whether or not the alien shots are guided and try to follow your position to hit you. And even if you stick with the easier difficulty switch setting, after earning 40,000 points, the missiles automatically become guided regardless. Meanwhile, the select switch chooses between 3 game types for 1 or 2 players that change how difficult the game is. In practice, this seems to mean how fast the aliens move and how often they fire at you. And in another twist, the default game mode is the most difficult one. It's worth noting that all of these Tigervision carts have somewhat bigger shells than those from other companies. As a result, depending on what you're trying to play them on, they may not fit. Contemporary reporting goes back and forth on how well they cram into a ColecoVision Module 1 cart slot, and similarly, the later Atari 7800 doesn't really work well with them either. Honestly, with the lack of standardization for cartridges, it's kind of surprising that this doesn't crop up more often. Threshold is a solid game, and while it's stripped down from its source material, it still holds up well. The 3 difficulty levels do a remarkably solid job of appealing to different skill levels. And while it lost a lot of the flair of the Apple II rendition, it's still a relatively unique shooting experience for the VCS, at least for this first month. Threshold's biggest problem is that it isn't Mega Mania, the other Astro Blaster derivative that came from the much larger and more popular Activision. Mega Mania retains the fuel gauge in its entirety. This does make the 2 games play a bit differently on the VCS itself, but it's clear which one of them had a better time on the market at the time. Yet don't let Threshold get lost in Mega Mania's long shadow, as it is different enough to be worth a look, even if its later counterparts on other platforms, such as the ColecoVision, play truer to the original. Finally, we're looking at a CommaVid game that also appears to have debuted in July, Room of Doom. Developed by Dr. Irwin Gaines as his first solo outing on the VCS, this is a marked improvement over the company's interesting yet awkward bug-themed shooter Cosmic Swarm, which came out a couple months earlier in May. Room of Doom pits a single player in an arena surrounded on all sides by walls and portholes, with gunmen lurking behind each of them. Depending on the game's settings, these foes will always keep the porthole open to fire at you, or will only open it periodically to make one shot before quickly closing it again. Your role here is to avoid their shots and shoot them all down yourself to move on to the next room. Complicating matters, you also have to deal with a monster that chases you down. While you can shoot and kill it, another will spawn into the room to take its place, and given enough time, will become immune to your bullets. As you progress, deadly objects also begin appearing in the room, meaning you have to avoid those, the monster, and the gunman's bullets all the while. Shooting the gunman gives you 75 points each, while the monster is worth 50 points each time you take it down. Clearing a room also earns you an extra life. The game settings are rather robust for Room of Doom as well. There are a full 64 variations here, adjusting whether or not the doors open and shut or are always open, whether or not the gunmen will fire diagonally in addition to straight ahead, the game's overall speed, and whether or not you can hold down the fire button to control your bullet's flight path. These options are in addition to the 4 major ones that control whether or not the player needs to be moving to fire their gun, and whether or not you can cancel a bullet in flight with a new one before it hits something. The difficulty switches adjust your starting room between 1, 3, 5, and 7 based on their positions, letting you leapfrog stages you may already be too skilled to deal with. In a feature with Game Liner's October 1983 edition, Gaines said that he liked having a lot of variations on his cartridges, as they allow players of different skill levels to practice or enjoy themselves, and can dramatically adjust how the game itself plays. His example here included how strategies need to be adjusted based on whether or not the doors are always open and if the gunman can fire diagonally. I can attest to this personally, as settings where your opponents can fire diagonally means there aren't really any truly safe spots in the room. And if the doors are always open, you can't even count on having a respite from any given attacker. Room of Doom does a few other interesting things too. For one, the game has a hidden continue feature. While the manual only hints at it and doesn't explain how it's done, it's actually fairly straightforward. By flipping the color/black and white switch after you game over, you'll restart on the level you're on. You don't keep your points, but you can continue to see more of the game. Room of Doom also has a little gameplay demo that runs when you leave it alone for a while. Last video I remarked that this seemed to be an innovation on the part of communist mutants from space, but Room of Doom appears to have pulled off the same trick a month earlier. These flourishes aside, Room of Doom is a truly excellent game coming out at a time when the VCS was swimming with them. The premise harkens back to contemporaries like Stern's Berserk or Mattel's Night Stalker, but it's unique in its execution. You're always under threat here with little room to breathe, particularly on the game settings that have you facing diagonal fire and open doors. And you really have to focus on finding the safe spots that you can and take your shots when you feel you can risk it. It may not necessarily be the prettiest game out at the time, but the action is intense. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't note that the name of the game developed its own cultural connotations among the early retro game scene in the 90s and 2000s, where Room of Doom became the common term for a collector's game room. I can't say I've heard anyone use it in recent years, but as a reference to a solid and perhaps a little overlooked VCS classic, maybe it's due a return. Of these 3 titles, game reviewers were least impressed with King Kong. Video Game Update found it dull and graphically unappealing, with King Kong himself looking like a teddy bear. In Electronic Games' January 1983 edition, King Kong got a write-up in an article about Donkey Kong-esque games, which found it to be a crude imitation of the first stage of Nintendo's title. On the positive side of things, in Logical Gamer's October issue, Alan Bechtold praised King Kong, calling it a solid adaptation of the Donkey Kong theme with great animations and a good presentation, aside from King Kong's sprite itself, while Mike Wilson called it one of the best DK-style games on the VCS, citing its lack of patterns to memorize, and the same thoughts on the graphics. Joyce Worley reviewed both it and Threshold in the October 24th edition of Arcade Express, finding King Kong's sprite particularly disappointing, as well as the single action screen. She did note that it was easier than other climbing games available by that time, such as Coleco's Donkey Kong, so it was likely a better fit for young children. She gave much higher marks to Threshold, praising the freer degree of movement compared to most shooters available at the time. Years later, King Kong was listed as one of the worst games sold for the VCS in the pages of Fanzine Digital Press. But further speaking to Threshold, Electronic Fun with Computers and Games highlighted it in an article comparing computer and console versions of the same game, where they mentioned the loss of the heat gauge and some of the graphical elements, but appreciated the color depth and the addition of vertical movement. Video Gaming Illustrated recommended it as one of the best space games on the market thanks to its swift and merciless gameplay and enemy patterns. Electronic Games gave it a Certificate of Merit for Best Science Fiction/Fantasy Game in the Arcade Awards, losing out to the VCS conversion of Defender. Contrasted with their praise of King Kong, the Logical Gamer reviewers were decidedly down on Threshold, with Bechtold and Wilson both feeling the graphics were outdated and the action nowhere near as intense as Demon Attack. Video Game Update also gave it a lackluster review, enjoying the graphical flourishes and animations, but ultimately finding the game fairly average. As for Room of Doom in the same Arcade Express edition as the Tigervision releases, Worley praised it as a challenging, high-scoring game with average graphics but better than most action. Lou Hudson also noted it as one of his cream-of-the-crop recommendations for the 1982 holiday season, alongside big releases like Demon Attack and Pitfall, and other more boutique titles like Rescue Terra 1. Video and Computer Gaming Illustrated's E.C. Mead and Jim Clark enjoyed Room of Doom, writing that it is the video game equivalent of Chicken in terms of your opportunities for offense, and that the game feels very claustrophobic, with the note that visually it shows the limitations of the VCS hardware. In Logical Gamer's November edition, Wilson echoed Worley's attitudes about the graphics, but found the game to have a lot of imagination and forced players to take risks to succeed, while Bechtold considered it better than Berserk, with interesting variations and a great deal of variety with the rooms themselves. Video Game Update recommended it, praising the variety of game modes. Yet, Joystick gave it a decidedly lower review, calling it a sorry Berserk ripoff with lackluster graphics and repetitive gameplay, ultimately suggesting people stay out of the room. Tigervision's output wound up being rather strong, this uneven start aside, with several solid conversions of minor arcade releases and computer titles. And CommaVid followed up Room of Doom with more unique original titles that have become cult classics in the years since. Yet neither made the kind of splash other publishers saw, based on the relative rarity of most of their games. But for those who did take the turn into the unproven titles, at least two of these three are very, very good. Next time, ready your zappers.